The battlefield stretched endlessly, a wasteland of jagged metal and scorched earth under an alien sky that glowed with an ominous red hue. Lieutenant Aaron Graves crouched behind the husk of a fallen drone, his pulse steady despite the chaos around him. The air reeked of ozone and ash, the screams of wounded soldiers blending with the relentless hum of enemy artillery. War had always been ugly, but this was something else entirely. Graves' helmet HUD flickered as he scanned the terrain. His squad was pinned down, the Jun forces closing in with mechanical precision. These insect-like aliens had no concept of mercy or surrender. For them, war was a mathematical equation, one they had been solving for centuries before humanity stumbled into their territory. "Lieutenant, we're out of time here." Sergeant Valdez barked over the comms, her voice strained but steady. She was Graves' second in command, a seasoned soldier with a knack for finding humor in even the bleakest situations. There was none of that now. Graves adjusted his grip on his plasma rifle, his gauntlet fingers tightening instinctively. "Hold the line," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Reinforcements are en route." "They better be," Valdez muttered, ducking as a barrage of energy blasts tore through their cover. The truth was, Graves wasn't certain reinforcements would come in time. He had seen too many squads wiped out in recent weeks, their names reduced to flickering icons on command screens. The Jun were relentless, and humanity's desperation had driven them to measures that turned even Graves' stomach. Behind their lines, in the safety of hidden laboratories, humanity had begun to fight fire with fire. The result was Project Chimera, a last-ditch effort to give soldiers an edge against the superior Jun. Graves had been briefed on it weeks ago, the details classified beyond even his clearance. All he knew was that volunteers were being altered, their bodies enhanced to amplify their natural instincts. Rumors whispered that these enhancements came at a price, a part of themselves they could never recover. Graves had declined the offer to volunteer. He had seen enough of what war did to the human soul without inviting more darkness. "Enemy flanking left." Private Chun shouted, his voice sharp with panic. Graves turned, raising his rifle just in time to fire a burst of plasma into the sleek, chitinous form of a Jun soldier. The alien screeched as it collapsed, black ichor pooling beneath it. Graves exhaled, forcing his focus back to the battle. They held the line for what felt like hours but was likely minutes, each second dragging as more Jun swarmed their position. Just as Graves began to think they might not make it, the sky above them split open with a flash of white-hot light. A dropship descended, its twin cannons blazing. "Reinforcements inbound," the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "Hang tight, Lieutenant." Graves' squad erupted in cheers, but his relief was tempered. The dropship's insignia caught his eye, the emblem of Project Chimera. As the ramp lowered, a squad of augmented soldiers stormed out. They moved with inhuman speed, their bodies a blur of power and precision. They tore through the Jun like predators unleashed, their efficiency terrifying to behold. Graves felt a chill creep down his spine as he watched. These soldiers weren't like him. Their eyes glowed faintly, their faces devoid of emotion as they slaughtered without hesitation. When the dust settled, Graves approached their leader, a tall man whose nameplate read Captain Dren. "Good work," Graves said, forcing himself to meet the man's unblinking gaze. Dren didn't respond immediately, his lips curling into what might have been a smile, or a snarl. "We don't fear war, Lieutenant," he said, his voice cold. "We fear what it awakens within us." Graves watched as Dren and his team boarded the dropship, leaving as quickly as they had arrived. The battlefield was silent now, save for the crackle of distant fires. Graves looked at his squad, battered but alive, and felt the weight of Dren's words settle over him like a shroud. What kind of monster had humanity unleashed to win this war? Graves tightened his grip on his rifle and turned back to his team. "Let's move," he ordered. The battle wasn't over, not out here, and not within. The infiltration of the Jun stronghold was supposed to be a textbook mission. Lieutenant Aaron Graves knew better than to expect simplicity, but this was something else entirely. The augmented soldiers from Project Chimera moved ahead of his squad, cutting through the alien defenses with brutal efficiency. Graves had seen his share of combat, but nothing like this. Captain Dren led the charge, his movements unnaturally precise, every strike calculated for maximum lethality. The Jun, fearsome and relentless adversaries, seemed almost helpless against them. Graves and his squad followed at a distance, providing support. "Cover the rear," he barked, gesturing for Sergeant Valdez to secure their flanks. She nodded, her expression tight with unease as she watched the augmented soldiers tear through the enemy ranks. "They're machines," Valdez muttered under her breath. "No," Graves replied grimly. "They're worse." Ahead, Dren and his team breached the central compound. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning metal and alien ichor. Graves stepped over the shattered remains of a Jun sentinel, its chitinous armor split cleanly in two. His stomach churned. This wasn't combat, it was slaughter. Inside the compound, the Jun resistance intensified. Automated defenses sprang to life, raining energy bolts down on the team. Dren barked orders, his voice devoid of emotion. The augmented soldiers responded in perfect unison, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to evade or destroy the threats with chilling ease. Graves' squad moved into position, taking cover behind the shattered remains of a wall. "Chun, get me a scan of the interior," Graves ordered. "On it," Chun replied, his hands shaking slightly as he activated the scanner. Graves could feel the tension radiating from his team. They weren't just wary of the Jun, they were afraid of their supposed allies. He couldn't blame them. There was something profoundly unnatural about the augmented soldiers, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind every time he watched them fight. "Lieutenant, we've got movement in the next chamber," Chun reported. "Looks like non-combatants." Graves nodded. "Hold fire. Let's clear the area and secure the civilians." Before he could relay the order to Dren, the augmented team was already moving. Graves shouted into his comm, "Dren. Civilians ahead. Hold your fire." Dren glanced back, his glowing eyes narrowing. "There are no civilians in war," he replied coldly. Graves' stomach dropped as Dren and his team entered the chamber. The screams began almost immediately. Graves sprinted after them, his squad following close behind. The scene that greeted him was a nightmare. Jun civilians, smaller unarmed versions of their warrior counterparts, lay scattered, their bodies torn apart. Dren stood in the center, his face impassive, blood dripping from his claws. "What the hell are you doing?" Graves roared, his voice echoing in the chamber. "They would have grown into warriors," Dren replied, his tone calm and unrepentant. "We're saving lives by ending theirs now." Graves felt a surge of rage, his fists clenching. They were unarmed. This wasn't necessary. Dren stepped closer, his towering form casting a shadow over Graves. "You still think this war can be won without sacrifice, Lieutenant," he said. "That's why you're weak. That's why humanity needs us." Graves' hand twitched toward his rifle, but Valdez grabbed his arm. "Not here," she whispered urgently. The moment passed, but the tension lingered. As Dren and his team moved deeper into the compound, Graves turned to his squad. "We're not like them," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't become monsters, no matter what." Valdez nodded, but the doubt in her eyes mirrored the turmoil in Graves' mind. The mission ended in success, the stronghold destroyed and the Jun forces routed. But as Graves stood amidst the ruins, he couldn't shake the image of the slaughtered civilians. Dren approached him as they prepared to extract. "You'll understand one day," he said. "War awakens the beast in all of us. The difference is, we've learned to embrace it." Graves didn't reply, watching as the augmented soldiers boarded their dropship. His squad followed, their silence heavy with unspoken fears. As the ship lifted off, Graves looked out at the burning horizon. The Jun were a formidable enemy, but he was starting to realize that the true battle might not be against them. It might be against the beast growing inside himself. The screams started as soon as Graves closed his eyes. He sat upright in his bunk, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The dreams were relentless now. Visions of claws tearing through flesh, of glowing eyes staring back at him from a blood-soaked battlefield. He had seen his share of horrors in the war, but these weren't memories. They were reflections of something darker, something growing inside him. Graves rubbed his temples and stood, his joints aching from another sleepless night. The tension aboard the dropship was palpable. His squad was silent, their usual camaraderie replaced by a brittle unease. Even Valdez, his steadfast second-in-command, avoided his gaze. The augmented soldiers had infected everything. The war, the mission, even their unity, with their cold efficiency and disregard for life. The comms crackled, pulling Graves from his thoughts. "Lieutenant," came the voice of Colonel Harlan, the project overseer. "You and your team will rendezvous with Captain Dren for an assault on the Jun's primary command base. This is the final push. Failure is not an option." Graves clenched his fists. He wanted to argue, to tell Harlan what Dren's team truly was. But he knew it would fall on deaf ears. Humanity had traded morality for survival, and soldiers like him were caught in the balance. The final mission began under the cover of perpetual twilight on the Jun homeworld. The air was thick with humidity and ash, the landscape an alien blend of jagged rock and bioluminescent flora. Graves led his squad cautiously, the augmented soldiers ahead of them like ghosts in the dark. The Jun defenses were formidable, but Dren's team carved a path through them with terrifying precision. Graves and his squad provided support, but it was clear they were little more than an afterthought. "Lieutenant," Valdez whispered as they took cover behind a ridge. "I don't trust them. This doesn't feel right." Graves glanced at Dren, who stood a few meters ahead, motionless and alert, like a predator scenting blood. I don't either, Graves admitted.
But we don't have a choice.
The assault reached its climax at the gates of the Jun command base. The augmented soldiers charged in first, their enhanced bodies absorbing or evading enemy fire within human speed. Graves and his team followed cautiously, navigating the chaos. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. The Jun fought desperately, their forces throwing everything they had at the intruders.
But it wasn't enough.
Dren's team tore through them, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. As they approached the central chamber, Graves' unease deepened. The air felt heavier, the distant sound of gunfire muffled by something deeper, a pulsing, almost organic hum.
Lieutenant, you're hesitating, Dren said, turning to face him.
His glowing eyes bore into Graves, devoid of empathy. You know what must be done. Graves looked past him into the chamber. The Jun leaders were gathered, unarmed and desperate. They weren't warriors, they were strategists, advisors, civilians. The sight of them triggered a memory of the previous mission, of the innocent lives slaughtered without hesitation. We're here to end this war, Graves said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. We're here to win, Dren corrected. There's no room for weakness. Graves felt something snap. For weeks, he had fought to hold onto his humanity, to resist the pull of the beast within. But now, as he looked at Dren, he realized the real battle wasn't against the Jun, it was against the darkness humanity had unleashed upon itself.
No, Graves said, stepping forward.
We end this, but not like you. Dren's eyes narrowed. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand enough, Graves replied, raising his weapon. You've become the enemy. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Dren lunged, his augmented strength overwhelming, but Graves fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. The clash was a blur of metal and blood, humanity and monstrosity. When it was over, Dren lay motionless, his glowing eyes dimming. Graves stood over him, breathing heavily, his hands trembling. Behind him, Valdez and the squad entered the chamber.
Lieutenant, she asked hesitantly.
Graves didn't respond immediately. He turned to the Jun leaders, lowering his weapon.
Go, he said quietly.
End the war but don't become like us. The Jun hesitated, then fled into the shadows. Graves collapsed to his knees, the weight of his choices crushing him. Around him, his squad stood silently, the war's true cost etched into their faces. As the chamber grew quiet, Graves looked at his hands, bloodied and shaking. The beast within him was still there, but for now it was caged.
We don't fear war, he whispered to himself.
We fear what it awakens. The end was near, but whether humanity could recover from what it had become was a question only time could answer.